On the morning of April 13th, 2011, in the quiet woods of Decatur County, Tennessee, 20-year-old Holly Bobo vanished into the trees, led away from her home by a man dressed in camouflage. For more than 3 years, her disappearance became a haunting mystery, a wound that would not close for her family or the small community that searched for her. The investigation swelled into one of the largest and most expensive in the state's history, yet it yielded nothing but dead ends and deepening despair. Then a series of arrests shattered the long silence, revealing that the evil they had searched for was not a stranger from some distant place, but a horror that had been living among them all along. This is the story of a family's unrelenting faith, an investigation's dogged persistence, and the long, arduous journey to find justice for Holly. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Holly Bobo was the embodiment of small-town promise. At 20 years old, she was a nursing student at the University of Tennessee at Martin, her future as bright and clear as the spring mornings she loved. She had a smile that seemed to radiate genuine warmth, a kindness that was not an act but an integral part of her being. Her hair was a cascade of blonde, and her eyes held a gentle intelligence. She was a cousin, a friend, a daughter, a sister. To her parents, Karen and Dana Bobo, she was the light of their lives, a girl who had grown into a remarkable young woman guided by a deep and abiding faith. She sang at church, doted on her cousins, and planned a future with her longtime boyfriend. Her world was one of family, study, and the familiar rhythms of life in Parsons, Tennessee, a place where people knew their neighbors and violent crime was something that happened elsewhere on the nightly news. The air in Decatur County on that Wednesday in April carried the scent of new life. Dogwood blossoms dotted the dense forests, and the damp earth was waking from its winter slumber. It was a place of profound quiet, where the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird were the prevailing sounds. The Bobo family lived on Swanigan Road, a narrow lane that wound through thick woods, their home set back from the pavement, nestled in a clearing. It was a sanctuary, a place where the dangers of the outside world felt a million miles away. Safety was not just an assumption, it was a fundamental truth of their existence. On that particular morning, the sky was a hazy white, the sun struggling to burn through a thin layer of cloud. A gentle breeze stirred the trees, carrying with it the quiet hum of a world beginning its day. The morning of April 13th began like any other. Holly was preparing to leave for the university to take a midterm exam. She dressed in a pink shirt and jeans, her mind likely on the questions she would face, on the clinical skills she was mastering. Her older brother Clint, who also lived at the home, heard the family dogs barking around 7:30 a.m. It was not an unusual sound, but it was persistent. He looked out a window and saw Holly outside with a man. He assumed it was her boyfriend, Drew, and thought little of it. He went back to his room, but the sounds from outside grew more disturbing. He heard what sounded like his sister's voice, distressed. Rushing back to the window, he saw a scene that would forever be seared into his memory. A man dressed in full camouflage was leading Holly away from the house, his arm around her. They were walking toward a dense, unforgiving tree line at the edge of the property. Clint watched, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It did not make sense. He said he heard Holly tell the man she loved him, a statement that only deepened his confusion. He thought perhaps it was a prank, some strange game her boyfriend was playing. But as the two figures disappeared into the woods, a cold dread began to seep into him. He saw the man was much larger than Drew. He saw Holly's movements were not entirely her own. She was being guided, controlled. The man was holding something, his hand near her side. Clint's confusion turned to raw panic. He grabbed his pistol, hesitating, unsure if he should fire, unsure of what was truly happening. By the time he decided to act, they were gone. swallowed by the forest. He immediately called his mother, Karen, who was at work as a teacher. His voice was frantic, breathless. He told her what he had seen, his words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and confusion. He described the man in camo, the way he led Holly into the woods. He told her he thought he heard Holly say the man's name was Ryan. Karen's world tilted on its axis. Every maternal instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. She told Clint to hang up and call 911 immediately. She left work, her heart pounding against her ribs, her mind racing through 1,000 impossible scenarios. The drive home was a blur of terror. The familiar roads seemed alien, menacing. When she arrived, the property was eerily silent. There was no sign of Holly, no sign of the man, just the quiet woods, now holding a terrible secret. The first Decatur County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Bobo home to find a scene of quiet panic. Clint, still reeling, recounted what he had witnessed, his story fractured by shock. Karen and Dana Bobo stood on their lawn, their faces etched with a fear that seemed to eclipse the morning light. The initial assessment was grim, an abduction. The woods that surrounded their property, once a place of peaceful seclusion, now represented a vast and impenetrable crime scene. The deputies began a cursory search of the immediate area, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of a struggle, any clue left behind. They found Holly's purse in the carport, left behind in her haste. Inside, her wallet and identification remained untouched. This was not a robbery. In the carport, near where Holly had parked her car, investigators noticed small, dark droplets on the concrete floor. The droplets led from the carport toward the tree line where Clint had seen his sister disappear. The substance was tested. It was blood. The quantity was small, but its presence was a chilling confirmation of violence. This was not a misunderstanding. Holly had not gone willingly. The blood trail painted a silent, terrifying picture of her final moments at home. She had been injured, taken by force from the very threshold of her sanctuary. The evidence was collected with meticulous care, each drop a potential key to an unfolding nightmare. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation was called in, signaling the gravity of the situation. The interviews began almost immediately. TBI agents sat with Clint Bobo for hours, pressing him for every detail. He described the man's clothing, his size, the way he walked. He repeated his belief that he had heard his sister say the name Ryan, a piece of information that would send investigators down a series of frustrating dead ends. He wrestled with his own inaction, the torturous loop of what-ifs playing over and over in his mind. Why had he not run outside? Why had he not fired his gun? The agents reassured him, explaining that his response was normal in a situation of such profound shock and confusion. Karen and Dana spoke of their daughter, her routines, her friends, her life. They could offer no explanation, no enemy who would wish her harm. Holly was loved by everyone. The idea that someone would target her was incomprehensible. As news of Holly's abduction spread through Parsons and the surrounding counties, the community responded with a surge of collective action. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers gathered near the Bobo home, ready to search. They were farmers, teachers, factory workers, and retirees, ordinary people united by a common purpose. They fanned out across the rugged terrain, pushing through dense thickets of brush, wading through muddy creeks, and combing every inch of the forest floor. The search was a testament to the tight-knit fabric of rural Tennessee. People brought food and water for the searchers. Local businesses closed so their employees could help. Pink ribbons, Holly's favorite color, began to appear on mailboxes, telephone poles, and storefronts, a silent prayer for her safe return. The first days of the investigation were a whirlwind of activity. The TBI set up a command post and the search expanded, eventually becoming one of the largest in the state's history. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras scanned the landscape from above. Search teams with cadaver dogs worked the ground below. Tips poured in, thousands of them. Every reported sighting of a man in camouflage was pursued. Every person named Ryan in the surrounding area was investigated. Investigators found Holly's lunchbox discarded on the side of a road not far from her home. Another small, heartbreaking piece of the puzzle, but the central mystery remained. Who was the man in the woods? And where had he taken Holly Bobo? The initial leads all grew cold, dissolving into rumor and speculation. The forest remained silent. The first week bled into the second. The massive, organized searches continued, but the hope of finding Holly alive began to dim with each passing day. The pink ribbons that had been symbols of hope now seemed to mock the family's growing despair. The media presence, once a constant swarm of cameras and reporters, started to thin out. The national news cycle moved on to other stories. For the Bobo family, however, time had stopped on the morning of April 13th. They were trapped in a state of suspended animation, their lives defined by a single agonizing question. Where was Holly? Anniversaries became painful milestones. Her 21st birthday passed without celebration. Thanksgiving and Christmas came and went, her chair at the dinner table achingly empty. The seasons changed. The vibrant green of the Tennessee summer gave way to the fiery colors of autumn, and then to the stark gray landscape of winter. The woods that had swallowed Holly transformed. The leaves that had hidden her captor's path now lay dead on the ground. The official searches were scaled back, replaced by smaller volunteer-led efforts. The command post was dismantled. The case, once a flurry of urgent activity, settled into the long, quiet grind of a cold case. The initial optimism that had buoyed the community curdled into a collective grief, a persistent ache that settled over Decatur County. Life, for most, returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the pink ribbons remained, faded by the sun and rain, a constant reminder of the girl who was gone. For the investigators at the TBI, the Holly Bobo case became a source of profound professional and personal frustration. The file grew thicker each month, filled with thousands of pages of interviews, forensic reports, and dead-end leads. They had a description of the suspect, a sample of the victim's blood, and the testimony of an eyewitness, yet they were no closer to finding her. The agent in charge of the case felt its weight every day. He reread the files, hoping to see something he had missed, a small detail that might break the case open. The pressure from the public and the media was immense, but it was nothing compared to the pressure he put on himself. Every time he spoke to Karen Bobo, he felt the burden of her unanswered questions. The case was a ghost that haunted the halls of the TBI, a symbol of a promise unfulfilled. The Bobo family existed in a state of agonizing limbo. They clung to their faith, praying for a miracle, for a sign, for any answer at all. Karen and Dana refused to let their daughter's memory fade. They gave countless interviews, their faces becoming familiar symbols of a parent's worst nightmare. They spoke of Holly's kindness, her dreams, her unwavering spirit. They pleaded for anyone with information to come forward, offering a substantial reward. They maintained Holly's bedroom exactly as she had left it, a shrine of hope against the encroaching darkness. They lived each day with a hope that was both a comfort and a torment. The uncertainty was a unique form of torture. Was she alive? Was she being held somewhere? Or had the worst already happened? Without an answer, there could be no peace, no closure, only the endless, agonizing wait. For 3 years, the silence was deafening. The case remained cold, a static entry in a long list of unsolved crimes. Then, in 2014, a change in leadership at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation brought a new sense of urgency. Mark Gwynn, the TBI's director, declared that the Bobo case was his top priority. He poured new resources into the investigation and, most importantly, assigned a new team to review the entire file from page one. A new lead prosecutor, Jennifer Nichols, was also brought in, known for her tenacity and her skill with complex cases. This infusion of new energy and fresh perspectives was the catalyst the investigation desperately needed. It was a signal that the state had not forgotten Holly Bobo. The new team began by re-examining every piece of evidence through the lens of modern technology. They conducted a more sophisticated analysis of cell phone records, mapping the locations of persons of interest on the morning of the abduction. They used geofencing data to identify any phones that had pinged off cell towers in the rural area around Swanigan Road at the critical time. This digital archaeology, unavailable in the early days of the investigation, allowed them to build a new timeline, to see connections that had previously been invisible. They focused less on the name Clint thought he heard, and more on the hard data that could not lie. Detectives spent months in a secure room, surrounded by boxes of files. They read every witness statement, every tip sheet, every lab report. They were looking for inconsistencies, for names that appeared in the periphery of multiple accounts. They noticed a pattern. The names of several local men with violent criminal histories kept cropping up, mentioned by different people in different contexts. One name in particular stood out: Zachary Adams. He was a known drug user and dealer with a reputation for unpredictable violence. He lived not far from the Bobo family. He had been questioned early in the investigation, but had provided an alibi and was dismissed. Looking at his file now with fresh eyes, the investigators saw red flags they had missed before. The crucial turning point came from an unlikely source. Investigators learned about a phone call made from a friend of Zachary Adams named Jason Autry. The call was to a pharmacy on the morning of Holly's disappearance. Phone records placed Autry's phone near a bridge over the Tennessee River, a location far from his home. More importantly, another phone had pinged the same tower at the same time: Holly Bobo's phone. It was the digital thread they had been searching for, a concrete link between Holly and a known associate of their prime suspect. Investigators also learned that Adams had been making frantic calls that morning, asking friends for help with a situation that had gone terribly wrong. He had reportedly shown up at a friend's trailer covered in mud and scratches, his demeanor erratic and paranoid. The pieces were starting to fall into place. With this new information, the investigative focus narrowed with laser-like precision on Zachary Adams, his younger brother Dylan Adams, and their friend Jason Autry. This group of men was known to law enforcement. They existed on the fringes of society, their lives a chaotic cycle of drug abuse and petty crime. Investigators began to build a psychological profile of Zachary Adams. He was a manipulator, a bully who used fear to control those around him. They believed he was the architect of the crime. His brother Dylan was seen as more of a follower, easily influenced and intimidated. Jason Autry was a hardened criminal, a man who understood the brutal calculus of survival. The TBI began to apply pressure, hoping to exploit the cracks in their alliance. Investigators brought the men in for questioning separately. They confronted them with the new evidence, the cell phone data, the witness statements that contradicted their alibis. Zachary Adams was arrogant and defiant. He denied everything, his story a tangled web of lies. Dylan Adams was nervous, his resolve crumbling under the weight of the interrogation. His account shifted and changed, full of inconsistencies that pointed toward his involvement. Jason Autry, who was already in jail on unrelated federal charges, was a different challenge. He was a seasoned convict who knew the system, but he was also facing decades in prison, and the investigators sensed an opportunity. They offered him a deal: tell them the truth about what happened to Holly Bobo, and they would recommend a more lenient sentence. The pressure worked. After initially denying any knowledge, one of the men broke the wall of silence. Jason Autry decided to talk. In a series of chilling interviews, he laid out the horrific events of April 13, 2011. He told investigators that Zachary Adams had abducted Holly, bringing her to his property. Autry explained that he arrived later to help Adams dispose of her body. He described how they wrapped her in a blanket, drove to the Tennessee River, and dumped her remains near a bridge. His confession was a brutal, unsparing account of the crime, filled with details that only someone who was there could know. He described the location with chilling accuracy. He had provided the investigators with a map to the truth. Autry's confession provided a specific area to search, but it was another man, a local property owner searching for ginseng in the woods of northern Decatur County, who made the final heartbreaking discovery. In September 2014, more than 3 years after Holly vanished, he stumbled upon a human skull deep in the woods. He immediately contacted law enforcement. Forensic teams descended on the area and, after a careful search, recovered more of Holly's remains, along with her wallet and some of her personal effects. The remains were sent to the state medical examiner's office. A comparison of dental records confirmed what everyone had feared for so long. The skull belonged to Holly Bobo. The agonizing search was finally over. The question of where she was had been answered in the most devastating way possible. With the confirmation of Holly's death and the confession of an accomplice, the district attorney moved quickly. On March 5, 2014, before the remains were found, but after the investigation had zeroed in on him, Zachary Adams was arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder. His brother Dylan Adams was also arrested and charged. The arrest of Jason Autry followed. The news sent a shockwave through Parsons. These were not shadowy figures from out of state. They were local men. People knew them. They had seen them at the gas station, at the grocery store. The revelation that the monsters they had searched for had been living in their midst was a profound betrayal of the community's sense of safety and trust. For the Bobo family, the news was a complex and devastating blow. TBI agents traveled to their home to deliver the information in person. The confirmation that Holly was gone, that she had been murdered, was the definitive end to 3.5 years of desperate hope. The finality was crushing. Karen Bobo later described the moment as a physical pain, a grief so profound it felt like it would shatter her. Yet intertwined with the sorrow was a sliver of relief. The agonizing uncertainty was over. They finally knew what had happened to their daughter. And now there was a new purpose: to see that the men responsible for her death were brought to justice. Their focus shifted from searching for Holly to fighting for her memory in a court of law. The legal proceedings began, culminating in the trial of Zachary Adams in September 2017. The trial was moved to Hardin County due to the intense media coverage in Decatur County. The prosecution, led by Jennifer Nichols, built its case methodically, piece by piece. They presented the physical evidence found at the Bobo home, the cell phone data that linked Adams and Autry to Holly's phone, and testimony from witnesses who described Adams's strange behavior on the day of the murder. The centerpiece of their case, however, was the testimony of their star witness, Jason Autry. For days, Autry sat on the stand and recounted the horrific details of the crime, telling the jury how he helped Zachary Adams dispose of Holly's body. The defense attorney subjected him to a grueling cross-examination, painting him as a career criminal, a liar who would say anything to save himself. The jury was left to decide whether they could believe a confessed accomplice. After 9 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for several hours. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The Bobo family sat together holding hands, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and prayerful hope. Finally, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The foreman handed the verdict to the clerk. Guilty, Zachary Adams was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, especially aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated rape. A wave of emotion washed over the courtroom. The Bobo family wept, their tears a release of years of pent-up pain and anxiety. Justice, so long delayed, had finally been delivered. Zachary Adams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years. His brother Dylan Adams later entered an offered plea and was sentenced to 35 years. Jason Autry, for his cooperation, received a sentence of 8 years. In Parsons and the surrounding communities, the verdict brought a sense of profound and somber closure. The long nightmare that had begun on a spring morning in 2011 was finally over. The pink ribbons, which had become a permanent part of the landscape, began to slowly disappear. The community, which had been united first in the search and then in the long wait for answers, could finally begin to heal. The case had exposed a darkness that many had refused to believe could exist in their quiet corner of the world. It forced a reckoning with the fact that evil is not always an external force, but can fester in familiar places, behind the faces of people seen every day. The healing would be slow, but it would be built on the foundation of a justice that had been served. Zachary Adams was transferred to a maximum security prison to begin his life sentence. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, a ghost in the system he had failed to outsmart. His name would be forever linked with an act of senseless brutality. He became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the darkness that had stolen the life of a bright and promising young woman. For the public, he largely faded from view, his fate sealed by the jury's verdict. He would grow old and die in a concrete cell, a world away from the Tennessee woods where he had committed his terrible crime. The finality of his sentence was a crucial part of the resolution for the family and the community. The threat he posed was neutralized forever. The Bobo family, having endured an unimaginable ordeal, chose not to be defined by their grief. Instead, they channeled their pain into purpose. They dedicated themselves to preserving Holly's memory and helping other families facing similar tragedies. Karen Bobo wrote a book, Remembering Holly, sharing her family's story of faith and perseverance. The family championed Holly's Law in Tennessee, legislation that streamlines the process for issuing alerts for missing adults who do not meet the strict criteria for an Amber Alert. They established a scholarship fund in Holly's name for nursing students, ensuring that her dream of helping others would live on. Through their advocacy, they transformed their personal tragedy into a public legacy of hope and change, honoring Holly's spirit of kindness and compassion. The resolution of Holly Bobo's case was not the result of a single dramatic breakthrough. It was the product of slow, painstaking work, of persistence in the face of years of failure. It was found in the digital echoes of a cell phone pinging off a rural tower, in the memory of a witness who saw something amiss, and in the courage of an accomplice who chose to break a code of silence. Justice came because a family refused to let their daughter be forgotten, because a community refused to stop searching, and because a new team of investigators refused to accept that the case was unsolvable. In the end, the story is a testament to the enduring power of a family's love, a love that outlasted the silence, conquered the darkness, and ensured that Holly's light would never be extinguished. Her memory endures not for the horror of her death, but for the beauty of her life.